was your graduation? Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So, thank you to Sandy Zeev for sponsoring bagels in honor of Richard Zeev. Thank you very much. And live streaming sponsored by Jackie Weiner. Thank you. You didn't know that, but it's on our list. And Sandy, you picked it up this morning, got the bagels up. So thank you so very much. I always say this and always have to say it, can't suppress it. Thank you to everybody for participating in our, let's call it our bagel adventure. And so far we're surviving the adventure, and very well too. Somebody put a banana on my desk this morning with a nice note. Thank you, whoever did. Appreciate it very much, anonymously. Okay, so welcome to those who are live streaming. Glad to have you as well. Okay, let's proceed with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we are working on the land of Israel in biblical literature. And just as we discovered when, way back in the fall, we took up the question of creation, it's easy to think that, yes, the Bible features creation story, and it happens at the beginning. The chapter 1, in the beginning, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth, and then chapters 2 and 3, another kind of beginning in the Garden of Eden. And after that, the story proceeds, and creation is something that happens first and not again. And then we discovered, didn't we, that the biblical authors deploy the creation idea in a variety of ways. Creation as combat, creation as hope. God created the world in an orderly way at the beginning. History is very jagged and rough. And the God who created was able to create order at the beginning. How about doing it again? Or second Isaiah, using creation now as a model for the redemption from Egypt. Redemption as a kind of new creation. So we discovered that the creation motif is given a variety of of uses in biblical literature. I don't know whether that was a surprise to you. I mean, I've known this before, but not nearly to the degree to which I came to appreciate it as we were working on it. I think we experience the same thing with the issue of the land of Israel. One can think of it as a given in biblical literature. God calls Abraham to go, and he goes, and the people wander through the wilderness and enter up in the promised land, and so on and so on. But what we have discovered is that the land of Israel is understood in a variety of ways in biblical literature. So I guess one of the sub-themes of this year's study is the variety to which the various topics are put, the different uses. And I think we can learn a couple of things from this at least. One is, I always think of the image of the atom, A-T-O-M, which is filled with energy, and if it's bombarded, it liberates its energy. And I think of these topics as analogous to the atom. We think of them as simple, but in fact, they're filled with potential. And the second is the brilliance of authors who are taking these themes and finding new ways to apply them, to deploy them, often in very surprising ways. We think of creation in terms of the chapter 1 of Genesis. Then when we get to some Psalms and Job, we see creation as combat, that God had to fight primordial monsters in order to be able to win the right to create the world. And of course, that suggests as well that if these monsters were not completely destroyed, they continue to lurk. And they are part of the landscape of our world. And that seems plausible, doesn't it? Given the chaos that is possible in history, in interaction between human beings and nature and human beings and one another. So it may seem as if the combat theory of creation is more realistic to the reality we experience than the Pacific idea of creation, where God has his way with the elements of the world. He just puts them into order, and God saw that it was very good, and that's that. And folks, from that first chapter, we wouldn't expect all the problems that emerge in our lives and in history. So I think the biblical authors are thinking about these issues and finding, not just in the abstract, but over and against the realities of the lived life, the potential that resides in these particular concepts. So I think that's one of the things we're learning this year. So, quick review. The land of Israel. We have seen it as a haven, as a place of rest, especially in the book of Joshua. We've seen it as homeland. That is the place where a full, natural, communal life can be lived. We've seen it as holy, and in two ways, inherently holy, in the sense that it is the land that God chose and that God has an intimate connection with. It inherently, and as a corollary, the holiness of the land precedes the arrival of the people of Israel in that land. We've also seen it as instrumentally holy. That is a place where a holy, sacred, sanctified life can be lived. Okay? So that it's an occasion for that. We've also seen it in terms of the promise of the promised land. And the promise is understood by biblical authors in two ways. As conditionally promised. This is your land if you live a good life on the land. If you follow the commandments, then the land continues to be promised to you. Contrarily, if you don't, you won't. And that prepares for the whole notion of exile. On the other hand, it is not only conditionally promised, an if-then logic, but it's unconditionally promised. I give you this land as an achuzat olam, an eternal possession, an eternal holding. And in the tension between those two ideas, conditionally and unconditionally holy, one could structure the history of the Jewish people on the land. God gave it to the Jewish people, to the Israelites. If you live a holy and ethical life, you'll stay there. If you don't, you won't. They didn't. Therefore, they were exiled. And think about the exile. There are at least two of them. Let's forget the Assyrian, the northern kingdom exile. Let's just think of the southern exile and the Roman exile. 70 years they were in exile in Babylonia. That's almost 3 generations. I asked myself, and I've said this before, would I want to go back to Hungary, where my grandparents came from? No. I've lived here. My parents have lived here. This is where I live. But God promised the people that they would come back from the Babylonian exile, and they did. As if to say, even though living on the land at a particular moment is contingent on behavior, there is a non-contingent component to this. And the return from exile, surprisingly, continues the logic of unconditional promise. Even though you reside in exile, this is still your land. It's in abeyance at this point for you, but you will return. And think of the exile after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70. One could say that the Jews as a people, as a collective, did not live on or possess the land for 2,000 years, from 70 of the Common Era to 1948. And yet throughout, they continued to yearn for the land. We'll look at some passages. As if, what's a couple of thousand years? We're going back, because that is a land promised to our ancestors forever. So what difference does it make that we're off the land for a couple of thousand years? The promise of unconditional possession is always valid. And no matter how long it takes, it's our land. Now, of course, there's the question, is it only our land? And that's a question that we're facing today. But what I might call the dialectic, the tension between contingent and non-contingent, can really account for, let's call it, the psychological connection between the Jewish people and the land. It doesn't matter that we're off the land. Of course, it's a catastrophe, but we're coming back. And that, of course, has something to do with the fact that when circumstances were right, the Jews did come back in their number. I just find it so fascinating that the Bible is able to tell us both. And of course, there's an uneasy connection between the two. How can it be uncontingent and contingent at the same time? And yet, that's what the Bible suggests, and that's what history confirms. And it confirms it only because, I don't know about only, it affirms it because the Jews have taken the unconditional part of the promise seriously. As if, yes, we're going back. Because the contingency contingencies of history really don't matter in terms of this promise. So we've been looking at a variety of uses, of formulations of the meaning of the land of Israel. I want to go on with it with some more ideas. So the next idea that I want to look at is the unique status of the land. Okay? And to begin, I want to quote a midrash, and you'll find this midrash very fascinating. And the midrash uses an analogy between the navel of a human being and elements of Jerusalem. Okay? Just as the navel is found at the center of a human being, so the land of Israel is found at the center of the world. And it is the foundation of the world. Jerusalem is at the center of the land of Israel. The temple is at the center of Jerusalem. The Holy of Holies is at the center of the temple. The ark is at the center of the Holy of Holies. And the foundation stone is in front of the ark, which spot is the foundation of the world. Okay? So that in increasing centers, Israel at the center of the world, Jerusalem at the center of Israel, the Temple Mount, and so on, until we finally get to the foundation stone, which is the navel, the omphalos, the idea of the omphalos of the world. So you can see that this midrash captures the idea that Israel is at the center of the world. It is unique insofar as one could understand the world as emerging from the outpouring of the meaning and ideas of the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies. Okay? So what we have here is a kind of sacred geography with Israel at its center. If we have a globe, what is the center of the world? Well, there is none. One can point to a variety of things. If we make the universe, the world flat, if we flatten it out and array it, let's say, as a rectangle, of course there's a center. So this is a sacred geography of a two-dimensional representation of the world, if you'll allow me to say that way. All right, I want to go on with that a little bit. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 11. I think this is one of the really surprising passages in the Bible. Chapter 11 of Deuteronomy, verse 10. Anybody have the page? 292? 292. For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors, like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. It is a land which the Lord your God looks after, on which the Lord your God always keeps his eye, from years beginning to years end. Okay? So there are two ideas here. One featuring geography and the other featuring God. Think of what the geographical idea is here. To Israel's west is Egypt, which gains its sustenance from below, from the waters of the Nile. Okay? Israel, to the east, doesn't get its sustenance from below. It gets it from above. Verse 11, but the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. So let me expand this one more step. It's It's not overtly said here, but I think it's got some plausibility. To the east of Israel is Mesopotamia. And the Mesopotamian civilization gets its sustenance from the Tigris and the Euphrates, from below. So that Israel is in the middle between two river civilizations. And those river civilizations are bound to look down for their values. Maybe I've overstated it. We depend upon the waters in the land. And if the waters dry up, if they're unpredictable, this has something to do with the psychology of the civilization and maybe its values. Whereas Israel does not, is in between two great river civilizations, Egypt and Mesopotamia, and does not get its sustenance from below, but from above. When you're in Egypt, you look down. When you're in Israel, you look up. Okay? So that it seems to me the biblical author is pointing to the difference in material sustenance from below, from above. But I think there's also a metaphorical implication. If we look up for our sustenance, we're looking toward God. So that the fact that the land of Israel itself is barren and doesn't have its sustenance from below causes the civilizations in Israel to look toward God. First of all, for their material sustenance, rain, and secondly, and it seems to me without much of a leap, for their spiritual sustenance alone. So I think that this passage suggests the fact that Israel is at, in some way, a center, not so much like the navel, it doesn't go quite that far, but in the Middle East, Israel is at the center between two great river civilizations. But it is also unique insofar as the topography, the geography of the land is conducive to looking up to the heavens for values and for meaning. So maybe you think I've taken this a little too far, but you can see that this passage, without being complete, points to something of the uniqueness of the land of Israel. And the uniqueness not only in terms of material objects, but in that it is a place in which theistic religion is bound to flourish, precisely because the natural resources are so few that we have to recognize that we survive and thrive in this land not from natural resources but from supernatural resources. I think it's an extremely powerful idea, whether or not you feel you want to accept it. Let's go on to the prophet Isaiah. I want to look at, let's get the passage first. Chapter 19, verse 23 of Isaiah. Candy?
Well, this argument that you just made about people having to look spiritually to God for their sustenance reminds me of Tevia's speech in in Fiddler on the Roof, where it says, God, would it be too much if you just gave me something to eat? Or why are you making life so difficult? And that's, of course, the question that Job, I think,
right. I think that's an interesting comment.
I don't know if that's relevant to what.
I mean, I think what's good and interesting about Candy's comment is a corollary of this sacred geography, we might say, is that we may not have predictable plenty if you've got the waters of the Nile or the Tigris and the Euphrates, in some way you can control how much material well-being you have. There's a kind of precariousness about living in the land of Israel, where you're really dependent on what God does for you, and therefore, when God doesn't seem to provide not only material well-being, but in Tevia's saying it too materially. So dependency on God can present the problem that we know. If you're all beneficent and all powerful, how come I'm suffering? And that's an example of that. So I think that's a good point. The advantage of the land of Israel is also, in a way, its disadvantage, that we're dependent.
Being dependent is limiting also.
Right.
I think it limits the technology that it could be developed, or science, or enlightenment, I don't know.
Yeah, when you think about it, the whole foundation of the scientific revolution and enlightenment is to create power for us to control our destiny. You may remember Francis Bacon's very important claim that knowledge is power. Okay? So it's not so much knowledge is useful for its own sake, but knowledge is an instrument. An instrument for what? For improving the estate of human beings. And that's what Machiavelli, for example, in politics, was much less interested in values than in success. The government, the ruler, should not worry about Christian values. What rulers should really think about themselves is that the instrumentality of power to gain control over society and other societies, so that knowledge becomes an instrument precisely for not being dependent upon the rains in its season or not, but that we can control our destiny. You know, and some of the critiques of this whole thing in the 20th century, I mean, certainly Heidegger is very worried about instrumental thinking, that we've become wedded to knowledge as a tool rather than some kind of wisdom that can help us live fuller lives. So that precisely the technological revolution, which is an attempt to gain control, has been under some critique for a while. Let's go to Isaiah 19, verse 23. 654. I'm sorry?
I have 656.
656. In that day, there shall be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. Okay, I don't want to suggest that the author of this passage has Deuteronomy 11 in mind, but you can see now that there are three civilizations at work here. Egypt to the west, Assyria to the east, and Israel in the center. In that day there shall be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. The Assyrians shall join with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians with the Assyrians, and then the Egyptians together with the Assyrians shall serve the Lord. In that day Israel shall be a third partner with Egypt and Assyria as a blessing on earth. For the Lord of hosts will bless them, saying, Blessed my people Egypt, my handiwork Assyria, my very own Israel. So this really, I think, maps the three civilizations in the same way. But now if I can put it this way, in eschatological terms, this is not just the three civilizations in terms of the source of their material well-being, but in terms of what will happen, what ought to happen at the end of days. that these enemies shall become friends, and that God will acknowledge that each of these civilizations is God's handiwork, is God's people. It's a fabulous passage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let me read it again, verse 24. In that day Israel shall be a third partner with Egypt and Assyria as a blessing on earth. For the Lord of hosts will bless them, saying, Blessed my people Egypt. I mean, think of it. My people Egypt, this arch enemy of the Israelites throughout much of the Bible, are now in the end of days, in that day, by Yom HaHu. Blessed be my people Egypt, my handiwork Assyria, my very own Israel. I think it's a wonderful passage and does again illustrate, but this is not its main point, that Israel is poised between Egypt and Assyria, and in that sense at the center. I'm just working on this notion of the center of the world, continuing the midrash about the navel, and then these passages about rain and so on. Jim?
But if we go back a little bit, if we remember how we ended up in Egypt in the first place, it's because of a famine. And this passage underscores the interdependence. They had to go to Egypt because Egypt had the food. Okay, so the passage just tells us at one point, and maybe it's a long way off, we have to realize we all need each other to survive rather than constantly, put it lightly, bickering
Yeah.
with wars and so forth. Instead of destroying things,
Yeah.
get to the point where you work with each other to produce things.
I think that works well if the focus is Israel, if it's Jacob and his sons, because they needed Egypt.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the converse is as powerful. What did Egypt need from others? Egypt was a self-sufficient civilization. Assyria, Babylonia, these were self-sufficient civilizations, weren't they? That used their power to expand.
But they were hospitable to a point.
Well, that's true, but I mean, I think you're pointing to the notion of needing one another. I'm not sure the idea works when you think of Egypt as opposed to thinking of Israel in this
Yeah.
regard. Yeah, yeah. River civilizations, I guess there's no such thing as absolute independence, but when your material resources are in your own land, in your ground, it's certainly a big head start on independence. Irv?
Let's skip back to the beginning of chapter 19, because he keeps saying, on that day, what happened? And that's the fascinating part. God comes to Egypt. He causes political disruption, beginning page 2, line 2.
Wait a minute, let's get to 19 verse 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
Political disruption. Verse 5, natural resources disruption. Water will flow from the sea, rivers dry up and be parched. They're falling apart entirely. They're 11. They're all fools there. What are they going to do now? They're going to turn to the real God. 16. They'll tremble before the Lord of hosts and so on. And so they've succumbed to our God, the God that we worship. And now when you get to 23, it turns out something similar has happened to the Assyrians. They're of a like mind. I'm not going to push this any farther than I want to, but it didn't happen naturally because of physical or structural things, but because God made it happen.
I think that's a really good point. So what Irv has done here is to look at chapter 19 as a whole,
Yes.
and not just the verses that we are featuring. And let me try something of a response. I'm not sure you'll find it adequate. I'm not trying to solve the whole problem. I think that 19 can be seen as something of a history of the world with a kind of goal in mind. And there's strife, and there's conflict, and nation against nation. This is reality. This is history as we understand it. Can we imagine that this process of strife, of mutual antagonism, can we imagine this process going somewhere? Can we imagine there's a kind of teleology to it? Is it just going to be one battle and war after another? Or is there going to be a climax and culmination? And the affirmative answer to that question in this passage is Bayom Hahu, on that day. And I think that Isaiah, I haven't looked at the whole chapter 19 for a long time, so you're alerting me to something I'd forgotten. I think Isaiah is giving us a kind of teleological, teleology means the idea of purpose, of goals. We know teleology works in our own lives. I mean, games have goals, for example. But does the natural order have a goal, or is it going on the way it is going on forever? And Isaiah is imagining that it's going somewhere. And where is it going? It's going to two kinds of goals. One, that strife among enemies will end. And they will become in some way allies. And part of what animates that is they will come to see that the one God who created the universe is the God of all people at the end, so that unity, the end of strife, the end of plurality, so on, we're fighting one another, can happen. Maybe Isaiah would want to say, must happen, in the sense that the end mirrors the beginning. The beginning was one God in a universe of total order. And then things fell apart right away. And they have fallen apart throughout biblical history. But Isaiah imagines an end to that process where, there's a scholar earlier in the 20th century, Hermann Gunkel, who organized psalms into different kinds of psalm. And he has this notion of Endzeit wird Urzeit, Endzeit, end time, wird becomes Urzeit, original time. And his notion is that history in a certain way is a circle, that the end will mirror the beginning. And I think that's what Isaiah is imagining. So yes, strife, conflict, but Isaiah is trying to say there will come a time when all of this will end, and the three great civilizations will become friends, and they will all acknowledge the one God. So it's a powerful idea, accept it or not. What do you think? What do you think?
I'm going to say something that nobody's going to like.
Okay. You want to whisper it to me?
Yeah.
No, don't get it.
Egypt and the former Assyria do not have a lot in common.
Yeah.
What do they have in common? They're both part of Islam.
Okay. Well, they're both part of Islam, and so, but I think Isaiah would respond to you by saying, look, if you depend upon the newspapers and the history books, you got a very good point here. There are irreparable fissures in the human community, and they're just not going to come together. So I think your comment points to something else about what Isaiah is doing. He's imagining what may seem impossible. But his premise is, I think his premise has two moments to it. The initial unity of humankind, all of us emerge, according to the Bible, from let us create human beings in our image. And so we're all equal at the beginning, or all come from the same source. And not only is there one humanity, there's one God. And Isaiah is daring to imagine that even though it's true there are ongoing struggles and wars and hatreds, that he's imagining a time when that will end. What's the value of that idea? First of all, it's a beautiful idea. Second of all, and I think more functionally, if one can assume something of the biblical worldview, that we're all made in the image of God, and to that degree similar, then it ought to be possible for us to regain initial harmony. It ought to be possible. And if there is one God, and if that doesn't work, if there is a universe, I mean, think of the word universe. We could call it a multiverse in which there's irreducible plurality. But to call it a universe is to suggest among the various entities that exist in the natural world, they all are part of one whole. So you could think about God. God is one, therefore we're all the same, essentially. Or you can think in terms of less in theological terms, but in philosophical terms or scientific terms. The laws of nature apply everywhere. There is a universe. And therefore, the idea of one universe might suggest that the many is not ultimate. What is ultimate is the one, that unity becomes possible. So I think that Isaiah is not saying, look, 2 plus 2 is 4, and 2 plus 3 is 5, and at some point they're going to become equal. That won't happen. But given the premises of biblical religion, which makes some sense, a universe, the equality of all human beings, which I think we all feel as an aspiration, is plausible, is powerful. And therefore, I think Isaiah is building his argument for a golden future, not just on fancy, but on some elements that really do exist. Maya?
So, two comments. The first one, you quoted the Midrash about the fullness of the world. So I have at home a copy of the 15th century Dutch map. And Jerusalem is in the center.
Good.
And on the top it's Christ's head and his arms and his legs. So I think that the center of the world was accepted not only by Jews but apparently also by non-Jews. The second thing that you were talking about river civilizations, I think that when the Nile goes out or floods, I think that those cultures were polytheistic.
Yeah.
And I think that when the river or the gods cheat you, then you vacillate. But if there is only from up, then there is from up. So I think that, I think Islam, what Herb was mentioning, Islam came not in the time of Isaiah. So that was Egyptians were pharaohs and all that. So that was a polytheistic religion, and whenever the gods let you in lurch, there was only one God. So
There's only one God for the Egyptians?
no, for the Hebrews.
For the Hebrews, yeah. I think that the Egyptians had a pantheon too, didn't
Yes.
they? With
Yes.
a God, one
Sure.
God at the top.
Well,
Was it Ra?
Yes, Ra. Yeah, but there were multiple gods.
Multiple gods. Right. Huh. I'm not sure I'm focusing on what you were focusing on, but I mean, the notion of a river civilization, as I was presenting it, is predictability. But what you're saying is the river may not flood.
Right,
And
no,
that-
the gods are fickle.
And the gods are fickle.
Yes.
And the gods are fickle. So that brings the two civilizations
Right.
closer together
Right.
structurally. Yeah, right. Okay. So let me do one more thing in this regard. I want to quote an essay on Nachmanides. Some of you know who Nachmanides is, a younger contemporary of Maimonides. So Maimonides dies in 1204. Nachmanides was born in 1195, so he was 9 when Maimonides died. Nachmanides was, next to Maimonides, I think the most important sage of medieval Jewry, or at least Andalusian Spanish Jewry. He did several things. He wrote a vast commentary on the 5 books of Moses. He was called to engage in a disputation, which was common in the Middle Ages. The Christians would call the Jews to court and say, explain yourself. Doesn't it say in your Bible, in Isaiah chapter 7, a virgin shall conceive? How come you don't believe in the virgin birth? There's a prediction that on that day, I can't remember the passage, somewhere in Deuteronomy, so that the Jews were brought before the monarch in front of a jury to defend themselves. And Nachmanides was called in 1260, something like that, and a converted Jew, a Jew who converted to Christianity, Pablo Cristiani, was the prosecutor. There are 2 records of that disputation, one written by the court, one written by Nachmanides. Guess who won the disputation in each of those 2 records?
Court.
So the prosecutor won it in the court record. Nachmanides won it in his own record of it. But because of that, even though Nachmanides was promised protection, that it was safe for him to say what he had to say, nevertheless, he was forced out of the land, migrated to the land of Israel, and there had an important role in reconstituting the Jewish community in Israel. There is still the Ramban synagogue there. I think it's mostly ruins, but part of it is there. And interestingly, though Nachmanides had written his commentary while he still lived in Spain, once he got to Israel and was able to see the land as it really is, he made some important alterations to his commentary. So he saw the commentary not just as a theological piece, but also something that really reflects the land of Israel. Also, Nachmanides is one of the early Kabbalists, one of the early mystics. He regularly says in his commentary something like, I can't remember exactly what he says, to see it truly, something like that. So he's not telling us what the mystical interpretation is, but he's pointing to it. He is also a defender and a critic at the same time of Maimonides. He believed that Maimonides' emphasis on philosophy was mistaken, misguided. One contemporary scholar, it's Gershom Scholem, who says that philosophy blew a foreign set of ideas into the house of Judaism. That philosophy is not indigenous to Judaism, and that Jewish philosophy flourishes only when the Jews are acculturated in particular societies, like Alexandrian society in the 1st century, or German society in the 19th century, or American society in the 20th century. Philosophy does not come naturally to Judaism, and Maimonides says, for example, on the issue of the creation of the world, that the philosophers believe that the world is infinite in time, and that the Bible thinks that it had a beginning. And Maimonides says that if Aristotle had a proof for the eternality of the world, he would have to believe it. That if reason can prove its ideas, then even if they disagree with faith, he would have to agree with it. And so Nachmanides points out that Maimonides' emphasis or interest in philosophy is dangerous to Judaism. Nevertheless, he defended Maimonides against those who wanted to excommunicate him or burn his books in the marketplace. So Nachmanides poised himself between Maimonides and his critic. So you can see that Nachmanides is a very, very formidable person who migrated to Israel, died in 1270. So how old was he? 75. So this excerpt that I'm going to read comes from a book by David Novak, who is a scholar of Judaism. The name of his book is The Theology of Nachmanides Systematically Presented. Oh my gosh. First, I don't know that Novak says this, before you pick up my book, have a scotch. It'll go down easier. So, here's what Novak says. Nachmanides draws on the ancient idea that all the nations of the world are under the control of angelic intermediaries, whereas Israel is under the direct control of God himself. And he has as a proof text Deuteronomy chapter 32, okay? So that the nations of the world have a tutelary angel who is an intermediary between those nations and God, whereas the Israelites, the Jewish people, have a direct access to God. But he stresses the centrality of the land of Israel at least as much as that of the people of Israel. Why is it called the land of the Lord? Quoting Hosea chapter 9. Is not the whole world the land of the Lord? Why is it called the land of the Lord? Why does Hosea get away with calling it the land of the Lord when the whole world is the land of the Lord? That's Nachmanides' question. He created everything and all is his. The basis of an answer is to be found in the verse, when the Most High gave the nations their portions, differentiating the human race. He set the boundaries according to the numbers of the children of Israel. For the portion of the Lord is his people. So when God created the nations, he singled out the Israelites. The meaning, Novak goes on, is that the Lord created heaven and earth and imparted power over the lower beings to the higher beings, causing a particular star or constellation to rule over each people in its land, as is known from the science of astrology. The Lord, glorious is he, is the supreme God and Lord of the entire world. But the land of Israel is the center of the habitable world, the Lord's own special portion. He did not place any angel over it as magistrate, administrator, or governor. Outside the land of Israel, even though everything is for the sake of his glorious name, there is no perfect purity because of the ministering angels who govern there, and peoples go astray after their officials even worshiping them. This is the meaning of the rabbinic statement: whoever dwells outside the land of Israel is like one who has no God. Okay. Powerful, of course. I think that Nachmanides would say this means they have an angel that is most directly in charge of them. He goes on to say, just as the nations of the world are not under direct providence, but through intermediaries is the idea, but are related to God only through intermediate heavenly powers, so are all other lands related to God. Only the land of Israel is directly ruled by God. The most honored Lord created everything and placed earthly beings in the power of higher beings, giving them power over every people in its land, to each a definite star and constellation. The constellations are in heaven, and above them are the higher angels who rule over them. That is why we say God is King of kings. The centrality of the land of Israel in the divine scheme of the universe is a momentous motif in Nachmanides' theology. Nachmanides criticized Maimonides for not listing the command to dwell in Israel as one of the 613 commandments. Now that's quite fascinating. Maimonides, as you probably remember, roamed around Jewish literature for the 2,500 years that preceded him, gathered it, organized it, and with reasons for selection showed what the 613 commandments of the Torah are. One sage describes the commandments into negatives, well, Maimonides does, negatives and positives. There are 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments. If you'll accept the assumption just provisionally that 248 are the number of parts of the human body, and 365 are the number of the days of the year, so that the 613 commandments encompass everything, all of me, all the time. So that when you list the 613 commandments, you've listed all the commandments. Some of you know the name Emil Fackenheim, who in the 20th century proposed a 614th commandment. After the Holocaust, we can't do anything that promotes the vision of Hitler. Assimilation, for example, helps to complete Hitler's work of the disappearance of the Jews. But what Fackenheim did there was something that one might think is impossible. If 613 is a number of totality, how can there be a 614th? And yet Fackenheim dared against tradition to do that. So evidently Maimonides did not mention as one of the 613 commandments the commandment to live in the land of Israel, which is quite amazing, actually. Maimonides spent most of his life outside the land of Israel. So the centrality of the land of Israel in the divine scheme of the universe is a momentous motif in Nachmanides' theology. Nachmanides criticized Maimonides for not listing the command to dwell in Israel as one of the 613 commandments. He criticized the patriarch Abraham for leaving Israel during a famine and going to Egypt where there was food. And then Nachmanides goes on. It was on account of this deed that it was decreed that his descendants would be exiled in the land of Egypt under Pharaoh's rule. Now that's clearly exaggeration. But what Nachmanides is saying here is that a luminary as great as Abraham is to be criticized for leaving the land, even under duress. And I think the idea would be that Abraham did not believe sufficiently that God would take care of him, and therefore he had to take measures into his own hands. So you can see, especially from this last passage, that for Nachmanides, the land of Israel is absolutely central to the meaning of Judaism.
So sorry to interrupt. It was an emergency. We need to take the Torah out of the ark in the chapel, and we need permission to do so.
To take it out to do what?
Photos for Max. His bar mitzvah.
Yeah, you can take it out, but don't open it up.
Okay.
Just take it out and have him hold it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Ellen.
How did Nachmanides defend virgin birth?
Well, I think what he did, I'm not certain this is what he did, but the word used there, Alma, I think, is it Alma, Betula? Betula is a virgin, am I right about that? Whereas I think that the word has a young woman and not necessarily virgin. So I think he probably pointed to the fact that, you know, even though the Septuagint, and therefore the Christian Old Testament, translates it virgin, that it simplifies the issue. But I'm not sure that was his argument. Stuart?
Quoting from Isaiah, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son.
Mm-hmm.
Let her name him Emmanuel. By the time he learns to reject the bad and choose the good, people will be feeding on curds and honey. So that is the passage that refers to a young woman.
Right, exactly. Chapter 7.
Yeah.
Yeah, chapter 7. Well, and I think scholars of the Bible, look, I want to say two things about it. First of all, we have in our tradition Midrash. And Midrash often goes way beyond the plain meaning of the text. And that's because those interpreters want to apply the Bible as their fundamental text to the requirements, the needs of their own day. And so in a certain way, they make the Bible relevant through interpretation. And as usual, the interpretation has value if and only if the community accepts it. Okay? So that's the first thing. And therefore, any tradition which thinks of the Hebrew Scriptures as sacred has an equal right to interpret it as they want to. And the Christian tradition, which of course already has in mind the virgin birth, does it? Is likely to read that back into texts in order to fulfill the idea of promise and fulfillment. So the Old Testament is the book of promise, and the New Testament is the book of the fulfillment, the realization of the promise. And so a Christian worldview is likely to look at the Old Testament, which for it is Scripture, through the prism of its own theological beliefs, just as the Jewish Midrash does the same thing. Okay? But one can respond to that in two ways. First of all, no, the Jewish tradition doesn't accept those premises, and therefore we're not likely to embrace that interpretation. And second of all, if you look at the language itself is ambiguous enough not to demand that interpretation. And we might also say furthermore that the Old Testament doesn't have virgin births at all, so that it doesn't seem to be a part of the worldview of Old Testament authors. And the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, was written over a period of 1,000 years. And if the idea doesn't come up unambiguously again over 1,000 years, you can bet that that's not part of the worldview. That's not a QED. That's not, therefore, that interpretation is wrong, because a tradition can interpret it as it wants to and is looking for that sort of thing. I think modern scholars of the Bible think that that's predicting the birth of King Hezekiah. And Hezekiah is one of 3 or 4 good kings in the entire history of the kings of Israel and Judah, something like 45 of them. Josiah is one of them, Asa, I think, Jehoshaphat. So Hezekiah does some very, very important things, and therefore the Bible elevates the idea of the birth of this future king. I think that's the Jewish interpretation. I don't know if I'd want to go so far as to say the scholarly interpretation. So I thought I saw another hand. Okay, so Okay, so let's move to another topic about the land. And that is the whole idea of exile from and return to the land. So for this, let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 29. 29:20. 321?
Yep.
29:20. Let's go back to verse 19. The Lord will never forgive the person who sins. Rather will the Lord's anger and passion rage against that man till every sanction recorded in the book comes down upon him, and the Lord blots out his name from under heaven. The Lord will single them out, and there the footnote indicates clan or tribe, from all the tribes of Israel for misfortune in accordance with all the sanctions of the covenant recorded in this book of the teaching. And later generations will ask, the children who succeed you and foreigners who come from distant lands, and see the plagues and diseases that the Lord has inflicted upon the land. All its soil devastated by sulfur and salt, beyond sowing and producing, no grass growing in it, just like the upheaval of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his fierce anger. So this is a picture of exile, where the land now lies desolate. All the nations will ask, why did the Lord do thus to this land? Wherefore that awful wrath? They will be told, because they forsook the covenant that the Lord, the God of their fathers, made with them when he freed them from the land of Egypt. They turned to the service of other gods and worshiped them, gods whom they had not experienced and whom he had not allotted to them. So the Lord was incensed at that land and brought upon it all the curses recorded in this book. Notice that what is punished is both the people through exile and the land itself, I suppose, for supporting it. The Lord uprooted them from their soil in anger, fury, and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as is still the case. Okay? So this is the idea of the conditional holding of the land. This is the if-then. If the people sin, they will be exiled, and the land will suffer. The people did sin, therefore the people were exiled, and the land does suffer. Of course, that last phrase, as is still the case, is very arresting, isn't it? Evidently, at this point, some of the people are still in exile. Okay? So who could that be? Probably the northern kingdom, where the 10 tribes are scattered. Okay? But Deuteronomy now is being applied to the southern kingdom. Okay? Conditional holding of the land, you sin, you're gone. Chapter 30. When all these things befall you, the blessing and the curse that I've set before you, and you take them to heart amidst the various nations to which the Lord your God has banished you, and you return to the Lord your God, the verb there I believe is shuv, vashavta, you return to the Lord your God, and you and your children heed his command with all your heart and soul. Think of the V'ahavta, that language again, which weaves its way through Deuteronomy. Just as I enjoin upon you this day, then the Lord your God will restore your fortune. Also the word of the Hebrew word shuv, lashuv, okay? So there is a kind of you return, God will return. Take you back in love. He will bring you together again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if your outcasts are at the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you. From there he will fetch you. Now, this is a very eschatological idea too, isn't it? That those who are scattered over the generations, where people may not know that they're of Jewish lineage, still God knows the origin, your origin, and will gather you back. And the Lord your God, verse 5, will bring you to the land that your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and more numerous than your fathers. So this is the idea of, it's a three-part idea: sin, exile, divine compassion, maybe there are four. Sin, exile, the return of the people, and therefore the return of the people in their hearts, which leads to God's returning the people. So we now are facing the question of exile from the land and a promise of return. In this regard, I want to read a couple of blessings from the traditional prayer book in a rubric that we call the Shemona Esrei. Many of you know what that is. The 18 blessings that are read in all daily services. Here's a trick question. How many blessings are there in the Shemona Esrei? How many blessings are there in the rubric called 18 blessings? 19. The answer is not Grant, who's buried in Grant's tomb. The answer is 19. One additional blessing was added during the early rabbinic period. So the Shemona Esrei, which has 19 blessings, can be divided into three parts. The first three blessings are praise, the avot, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotel, Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, and so on. So it talks about God in history. The second blessing, the Gevurot, are God's great acts in nature. Okay? So the first two blessings, which are also in the Reformed Prayer Book, talk about God's involvement in history and in nature. I could say that this creates a problem. Doesn't God then become too close to human beings and the human condition? How about God's transcendence? Those first two blessings talk about God's nearness, God's immanence. And the third blessing, the Kedusha, talks about God's holiness. Involved in history, involved in nature, transcendent over both. So those first three blessings capture a very nice idea of the theology of God's nearness and God's remoteness, or transcendence and immanence. Then we have 13 blessings that are petitions. Those petitions can be divided into three parts. Essentially, petitions for the individual, petitions for the community, and a final position that says, accept our petitions. Okay? And then the last three blessings are thanksgivings. So the 19 blessings can be divided into 3, 13, and 3, and the 13 can be divided into 6, 6, and 1. Petitions for the individual, petitions for the community. And so I want to read the petitions of the community. Now think about it. The Shemona Esrei is recited 3 times a day, every day. And for those who pray 3 times a day, that's 3 Shemona Esreis, plus an additional one on Shabbat. So think of the Jews in 15th century Bologna in Italy, reciting these blessings many, many times during the week, so that they are stamped. Those petitions, do X for us, is part of the thought processes, the worldview, the psychology of people from the destruction of the temple in 70 through their day. Okay, now here are some of them. Sound the great shofar for our freedom. Lift up the banner to bring our exiles together and assemble us from the four corners of the earth. Blessed are you, O Lord, who gathers the dispersed of his people, Israel. Okay? Now that pretty much says all of it. There are more blessings, but every single day, 3 times a day, please bring us back to Israel. In this last sentence, which is called the Chatimah, the signature sentence of the blessing, the verb is a participle, not a past tense or a future tense. A participle is ongoing action. Blessed are you, O Lord, who gathers the dispersed of your people Israel. It's as if God is always in the process of gathering us. Even if it doesn't happen, it's on God's mind as a promise. Okay? The next blessing. Restore our judges as at first, and our counselors as at the beginning. Remove from us sorrow and sighing. Reign alone over us, O Lord, in kindness and mercy. Clears in judgment. Blessed are you, O Lord, who loves righteousness and justice. Return in mercy. This is another blessing. To your city, Jerusalem, and dwell in it as you have promised. Rebuild it soon in our days as an everlasting structure, and speedily establish in it the throne of David. Blessed are you, O Lord, builder of Jerusalem. And once again, builder is a participle, boneh Jerusalem. The one who builds. Not who built, but who builds Jerusalem. Okay? So, one blessing for God to have the shofar blown to bring us back. And now, more specifically, rebuild the city of Jerusalem and dwell in it as you did in olden days, and establish the throne of David, the Messiah of Jewish yearning. The Messiah of Jewish yearning is not the individual who is going to save us from perdition or save our souls. This is not a supernatural figure. The Messiah is merely a good king who will reign and create and produce justice in the world and then die. Okay? So when asking for the throne of David, it is Mashiach. Mashiach meaning the one anointed, but not a supernatural being. Speedily cause the offspring of your servant David to flourish, and let his glory be exalted by your help. For we hope for your deliverance all day. Blessed are you, O Lord, who causes salvation to flourish. So you can see this notion, this logic of exile and return, is not just an idea in the minds of medieval Jews, but an active idea, activated every single day, over and over again, yearning for return. I mean, imagine Jews in Bologna. It's been 1,000+ years since the Jews were in Israel. They're still hoping for it. So it keeps hope alive, and it keeps memory alive, which is the grounds for hope. So what we've seen here in the Bible, especially the twin notions of contingent and non-contingent views of the land of Israel, are activated throughout the Middle Ages. Okay, so let's look here at Isaiah chapter 40.
What verse?
Chapter 40, verse 1.
Oh.
698. 698. Okay. So let me just say something about the book of Isaiah. According to modern scholars, though this paradigm has been questioned in the last 20 years or so, there are really 3 Isaiahs. The first Isaiah wrote chapters 1 to 39, and he's known as the Isaiah of Jerusalem. So he lived in Israel before the destruction of the temple. The second Isaiah is known as the Isaiah of the exile, chapters 40 through 55. And this is the Isaiah who went into exile with the people, a different person, and who prophesied, comforted them and prophesied. The third Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, is known as the third Isaiah, the Isaiah of the return. Okay? So it's quite clear that there are different perspectives in each of these three Isaiahs, which lay the groundwork for thinking that they are three different individuals. Why they were put together is a problem, and has led some scholars to believe that the book of Isaiah is more coherent than the idea of first, second, and third Isaiah seems to acknowledge. So there is now an investigation of the continuity of themes. What we're looking at in chapter 40, therefore, is the beginning of the writing of second Isaiah, the Isaiah of the exile. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and declare to her that her term of service is over, that her iniquity is expiated, for she has received at the hand of the Lord double for all her sins. A voice rings out, clear in the desert a road for the Lord, level in the wilderness a highway for our God. Let every valley be raised, and every hill and mount made low. Let the rugged ground become level, and the ridges become a plain. Think about that. Think about that. What does that suggest? Level in the wilderness. Let every valley be raised. Let every hill and mount be made low. What's the suggestion here? What's the idea?
A new creation.
A new creation? God's authority over the world? Also, what? That the trek, what, Jim? Harmony, ease of travel, rather than having to climb the mountains and to dip down low into the valleys. Everything will be made plain so that the journey will be as effortless as possible. Or to put it another way, it's a miracle. This return is, look, if the topography of the land is going to be radically changed, either it's a metaphor for ease, or Isaiah is suggesting that the return is a miracle that is being delivered by God. The presence, verse 5, of the Lord shall appear, and all flesh as one shall behold, for the Lord himself has spoken. The announcement of return, right? Comfort, verse 1, comfort my people, nachamu, nachamu, ami. Verse 6, a voice rings out, proclaim. Another asks, what shall I proclaim? All flesh is grass, and all its goodness like flowers of the field. Grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows on them. Indeed, man is but grass. Grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God is always fulfilled. Okay, so here's a question. We seem to have two different ideas so far in Isaiah. The first idea, verses 1 through 5, is that God has now announced that the exile is over and that the people are getting ready to proceed, and everything will happen to make that trek back as easy as possible. Starting in verse 6, we seem to have a totally different idea. All flesh is grass, all its goodness is like the grass withers, the flower fades. Grass withers, verse 8, flower fades, but the word of our God is always fulfilled. Okay? So a very vast contrast between the transience of human beings and the eternality of God. What does the second section, verse 6 through 8, have to do with the first verses? The return to the land. It's as if Isaiah starts by talking about return, then he turns to something purely theological, that God of all beings is eternal. You see a connection between the two of these? Jim?
It's the idea of timelessness through generations. In other words, okay, none of us are going to be here for a very long time, but the genealogy continues. You can picture a chain. The beginning is the end.
Okay.
Well, that's what this is telling you.
So are you saying the connection is that part A is about a moment in history when the people are going back, and B is about the endless chain, so that part A is a part of that larger continuum?
Yeah, but the notion of time is the human's problem.
Okay.
It's not God's problem.
Okay. Part A is about human time. This is a moment in time. Part B is about timelessness. Okay? That's a nice connection. Anything else? Don't you see that this question has to be answered? Because is chapter 40 of Isaiah merely a collection of random different ideas? Or is there some coherence to this? Joyce?
What I hear is a promise is a promise. God's promise is in perpetuity.
Very good. I like that. I hadn't thought of that. So that we have a moment of return here, which is the fulfillment of a promise. And God's promise is secure because God is eternal. Okay. Did I get it?
Yeah.
Say it again.
Well, I liked the present participle. Is being fulfilled.
Okay,
But it's also eternal.
Okay, very good. So that the return, the promise of return is something that could be counted on.
Absolutely.
Because God is the one who brings people out of the dungeon.
Well, God promised it.
Yeah, God promised it. Okay.
And the land, well, what I hear
Yes.
in it is the embodiment of the promises.
Very good. So the land itself is the focal point, the embodiment of all these promises. It's the locus of all of this. Okay, so what Doris is suggesting is, Jim's suggestion is the contrast between time and eternity. Time is us, eternity is God. Doris's idea is that I might say about part A, really? I mean, they've been in exile for 60, 70 years. It looks like they're settled. What are the chances that they're coming back? When you're dealing with God, who makes promises and who is eternal, it becomes less a preposterous notion. So that what Doris is suggesting is part A is about a contingency in history, which may have happened, may not have happened, probably wouldn't have happened if it were only historical processes. In order to show the power of that promise, that fulfillment, you turn to theology. Let's talk about God so that the contingencies of history seem all the more probable, or I might want to say miraculous, This is a miracle. This is a part of what the Germans call Heilsgeschichte, the history of salvation, redemption. It's a very Protestant term in a way, but not salvation with a capital S, but just the good things, the really good things that happen in history are part of the history of the people. So what's puzzling about this is there's a turn from the moment in history to what makes that moment not only credible and miraculous, but praiseworthy. Let's go on for a few more minutes. Ascend a lofty mountain, verse 9. O herald of joy to Zion, raise your voice with power, O herald of joy to Jerusalem. Raise and have no fear, announce to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold the Lord God comes in might, and his arm wins triumph for him. I mean, who's going to beat the Babylonians so that the Israelites can leave? This is going to require something more than the historical process, because history alone doesn't seem to be enough to legitimize the return of a whole people. Now, they all don't come back. See, his reward is with him, his recompense before him. Like a shepherd, he pastures his flock. He gathers the lambs in his arms, carries them in his bosom. Gently he drives the mother sheep. Now, I don't know whether this is plausible, but here's the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. Not just, so to speak, in the abstract, but now applied to a particular historical situation. This is the shepherd of the people acting on their behalf to now at long last liberate them from exile and bring them back. Who measured the waters with the hollow of his hand, and gauged the skies with a span, and meted earth's dust with a measure, and weighed the mountains with a scale, and the hills with a balance? Who has plumbed the mind of the Lord? What man could tell him his plan? Whom did he consult, and who taught him? Guided him in the way of right, who guided him in knowledge, and showed him the path of wisdom. I mean, this is really exalted poetry, isn't it? The metaphors, the imagery. The God who was able, let's go back to 12, who measured the waters with the hollow of his hand. It's like an architect or a builder looking at plans. I see I have to make this long and this wide. Who measured the water? And who could have done this? Who measured the waters with the hollow of his hand, and gauged the skies with a span, meted earth's dust with a measure, weighed the mountains with a scale, and the hills with a balance? Who could have done this, Isaiah is asking? And the answer is no one. None of us. But since God did do this, something that would seem impossible for us, God is the one who could bring the Jews back from exile. So this is all an argument for the miraculous quality of this particular moment. After all of this Deuteronomy stuff about you've sinned, you violated the covenant, I'm sending you into exile. Prophet Amos says, and that's the end. There are 9 chapters in the book of Amos. Chapter 8 says, and this is the end, which is probably why chapter 9 was added by somebody else to soften that blow. But so this raises this episode of return after the long period of punishment to a very, very high register. Okay, I think this concludes. There are a couple of more things I wanted to read, but maybe next week we'll go on to another topic. Okay. Shabbat Shalom.
Good. Of course, the first so many verses of Isaiah bring a handle. The second promise
Say that again now. The first verses of 2nd Isaiah.
of Yeah,
Jordan mentioned.
bring up Handel. Handel,
Of Handel's Messiah.
yes.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize you were talking about that. Okay, okay, do that.
And the second verse is bring up Brahms, the German Requiem.
I actually
I didn't know that.
Third, third movement.
Of the Requiem,
Yes.
I'm gonna go back to it.
Oh, you should.
How much of Isaiah does either of them? Well, I imagine that Handel does a lot of it,
Yeah,
because it's all about promises.
yeah.
have everything.
Oh, that's so interesting. Do you love the German Requiem?
A fantastic piece.
I really don't. I love how glorious are your tents.
Yeah.
That's the fourth movement. I mean, that's the rest of us leave me cold. Maybe I just haven't spent enough time.
Probably.
Okay. Good. Are you going to the concert this week? Because they're doing the Bear Violin Concerto.
Yeah.
You know it?
Oh, yes.
Isn't it great?
I think it's great.
I do too.
Arthur doesn't like it so much.
It's a hard piece to get into.
Zell did that with Julia.
Did he?
Yes.
Great. And they're also doing the Grand Partita, Mozart's Grand Partita.
Yeah. I don't like the performance. I would prefer to listen to CDs.
Of these pieces or
Yes.
period?
Yeah,
These pieces.
yeah.
But not about every piece.
No,
Oh, so what makes these pieces, what makes you say that about these pieces?
actually, I think I grew up with
Listen,
these, listening to performances.
yeah, I'm of two minds about it. I do know what you mean. But there is something in a great hall and great musicians and the energy emanating from
Yeah.
the stage. And it's true about theater. It's the argument for live theater and so on. But I do know what you mean about it. I've been listening to Chopin's Etudes, which are amazing,
Yes,
and wondering, would it add to be there and see the pianist do it? I think it might actually, especially of the virtuoso parts of it.
if you have a great performer. Well,
Rubinstein was one of those, wasn't
but he didn't do the etudes. Yes, he did a few of the new etudes. And Horowitz too.
Horowitz?
Yeah,
he? Didn't do them?
yes,
Did or didn't?
did not.
You know, his famous return to Carnegie Hall in '64.
Yes,
He did play one etude.
yes,
Number 8, and it's amazing. And the audience gasps at the end. Do you have access to it?
oh yes,
Take a listen to the etude.
okay,
I think it's Opus 10 number 8. And listen to the audience. Can you access that moment?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
okay,
Listen. Let me know what you think.
okay,
I'm going back to the grounds.
yes, you should.
So I was thinking this morning that Major League Baseball has given you a new metaphor of talking about God. He doesn't have a pitch clock. Right?
In other words, he can stand out there on the mound as long as he wants.
Well, I mean, like Jim was saying, there's our time. And then there's God's time. You can't measure, I suppose, God's end of his promise by our time.